Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Dave Gregory. I'm Minister of Croxley Green Baptist Church, and I'm also the convener of the Baptist Union Environment Network and the chair of the John Ray Initiative, an educational charity which connects science, the environment, and Christianity. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you this morning as part of this future church day when we are thinking about issues which are going to shape the life of the church going forward and some of the issues that we need to address. I'm going to be speaking this morning on the subject of rewilding the church ecosystem. Before I was a minister, when I started 20 years ago, before that I was involved in meteorology and climate research, building climate models. And issues around the environment and climate are still things that I take an interest in and try to encourage churches and community groups, schools as well, to think about. You will be aware, I'm sure, from just watching the news or browsing the internet, how important issues around the environment are becoming in our world, and especially in this pivotal year. This is the front cover of a New Scientist a few weeks ago, special issue on climate change. Climate Change, your guide to a critical year. Where are we now? How bad could it get? And what do we need to do? That picture on the front cover of the part of the hemisphere of the Earth is actually the temperature anomaly of the Earth for March 2021. It was extremely warm. There are only patches where the Earth was colder than the average pre-industrial levels of temperature of the planet. Mind you, you might find it hard to believe the way April has been in the UK this year, but weather doesn't make climate, and that's one of the hazards of living between an ocean and a continental region where we are in the UK. Later this year, we are hosting in this country the United Nations Climate Conference, which will try and put some flesh on the bones of the Paris Accord of 2015. And this next decade is really going to be a crucial decade to see whether we will be able to reach net zero carbon by 2050, which is the intention of that accord in 2015. Let me unpack a little bit what we mean by rewilding and the word ecosystem a little. Ecosystem just refers to the way living organisms interact together in any given context or environment, from small scale to the entire planet. Of course, there are different types of ecosystem across our world. Here are two types of tropical forests that we find in our world. The picture on the left is that of virgin Amazon forest in Peru. A real mixture of species and trees, a chaotic, disordered mix of life. This is one type of ecosystem. Of course, increasingly, this kind of forest is being cut down and turned into plantations. This is a plantation for palm oil. And I think you can see something of the difference. The trees are much more uniform. The ground is much more barren. It's a much more structured and ordered environment. And we know actually that the diversity of these two ecosystems is very different. So the diversity of the Amazon native Amazon rainforest is incredibly rich in variety of plants and animals and sustaining lots of different species and types of life. Whereas this ordered human-made tropical forest, so the palm translation, is much more barren, almost a desert compared to the verdant richness of the Amazon. Rewild, in a sense, is an attempt to bridge these two scenarios. It's an attempt to correct what humans have done to the environment. Often the rewilding experiment that took place in the Yellowstone National Park in the US with the reintroduction of wolves to the park While it was controversial, it's given an example of how rewilding can really change and make the landscapes more richer. The introduction of wolves reduced the incidence of the caribou, which were stripping bark off the trees and restricting the variety of trees that there were there. And with the wolves being reintroduced again, the population of caribou go down, and the diverse nature of trees increases, watercourses change. It's an example of what can happen when we try and correct the differences, the changes that humans have brought about in the environment. Of course, not all rewilding is deliberate and planned. This is a picture of the city near the Chernobyl nuclear reactor in the old Soviet Union in Ukraine, and a city abandoned because of radioactive pollution. And the wildness of nature has started to re-inhabit the city trees. But we also know from studies that there's a rich diversity and increased diversity of plant life despite the radiation, and animal life in that region. This at the bottom picture is a rewilding experiment closer to home from the Thames estuary near Southampton, where sea defences have been breached, and land which has previously been reclaimed from the sea has been allowed to become a tidal marsh again, and that's caused an increase in the variety of bird life that you'll find in those zones. Rewilding, ecosystem and ecology have started to appear in the Christian literature. In some ways, I think we have borrowed from the organizational managerial world these phrases, just in the same way as perhaps into the 80s and into the 90s, we borrowed ideas of vision and goals, and we brought those into church life. Here are a couple of books that I've read recently, Rewilding the Church and Imagining Mission, both of which use aspects of the idea of rewilding and ecology to describe the nature of the church, to describe the ecclesiology of the church, especially in the context of pioneering and fresh expressions, new ways of being church. Both use rewilding and ecology almost as metaphors and parables to explore different aspects of church life and mission. Rewilding, claims Steve Aylesthorpe, is a lens through which we can understand the complex challenges that we face as church at the beginning of the 21st century. Whereas Johnny Baker and Kathy Ross say, imagine the church is like a forest, growing, trying to add diversity or reintroducing some ancient species, as they discuss the influence of pioneering might have upon the growth of the church and growth of God's kingdom today. I think there's much to commend these books, and I certainly gained much from reading them and was very stimulated by them. But I have a concern too. My concern is that in a world where our environment is under threat, where the climate is changing due to human activity, that we shouldn't just stop in thinking about rewilding and ecosystems and ecology. We shouldn't just stop and use them as ways to explore our life together as the church. Actually, we need to think about rewilding and how, as Christians, we're part of a wider community of creation that God has made, and understand how we are to be a part of that creation as part of our living for God and for his mission and with his mission. Of course, the issues of the environment and climate change are very much on the wider public discourse at the moment. There's been recently a documentary about Greta Thunberg and the movement that she has sparked amongst children and young people with the school strikes, and then into the millennial generation as well. And she is a wonderful champion for the environment, inspiring people. And she comes up with wonderful phrases, doesn't she? Our house is on fire, to describe the urgency of which there is at the moment around the climate. But it spreads across the generations, and David Attenborough, a well-known broadcaster and naturalist, is also becoming, for his generation, a champion of concern for the environment, seeing that the changing climate that we're living through is the greatest threat for 1,000 years. And that's certainly true. The planet is warmer than it has been for the last 1,000 years. And in fact, if you go back to the last 500,000 years, the Earth is now warmer than it has been for the last 500,000 years, not just the last 1,000 years. This graph here is a Met Office plot, actually, of just the temperature of the Earth from 1850 to 2020. And in the early parts of this graph, there are fluctuations up and down as the Earth warms and cools. But gradually, as you move into the 20th century and the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, the planet is becoming much warmer than the average between 1850 and 1900, what we call the pre-industrial level era. In fact, the last 10 years in this sequence show that the Earth has been the hottest that it has ever been through its history. We've already exceeded 1 degree for many of the years of the last decade above average. There are many ways of depicting this, and this is one of the new ways that's been kicking around for the last few years. It again shows that the Earth has been warming gradually, then more rapidly between 1850 and 2020. And scientists believe that this is due to the rising amounts of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. By 2020, we had put 50% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because of our use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, than there were before 1800. So we've already increased the carbon dioxide by 50%. And by increasing carbon dioxide, that traps energy from the sun into the Earth system rather than letting it escape back into space, which causes warming of the system. Our climate models, the way is one way we can explore what's going to happen in the future. And by running climate models forwards, the science is telling us that if we don't do anything, if we continue to produce carbon dioxide at the rate we are doing now, potentially we will end up with a planet that is 5 degrees warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. 5 degrees warmer. Now, the science also tells us that the planet can cope with a certain degree of change, won't be unimpacted, but it will be less impacted dramatically so. And if we can keep the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, then that is a safer level. However, the pledges that were made so far, even with the ones that were given this week, indicate that actually by 2100, we will be at about 3 degrees temperature rise. That's still quite a significant rise. It would be better if we could hit 2, much better if we could hit 1.5, although that is going to be very difficult. Technically difficult, because it will involve, after 2050, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere using techniques that we don't yet know how to do on an absolutely global scale. We're already seeing impacts at 1 degree. We're already seeing extreme weather events, heats and droughts, extreme rainstorms, in Australia, heat and drought a few years ago, massive forest fires, destroying ecosystems there. And at the same time, intense floods over in East Africa, part of a linked weather system, which is a natural phenomenon, but with climate changing, with the Earth warming, the intensity of those swings in that weather system get even larger. And of course, we're seeing some of the warmest temperature rises over the North Pole, where the sea ice extent is the lowest it's ever been, and not only the lowest in terms of its surface area, but the thickness of the ice. It doesn't have time to grow again in the winter months between the summer seasons. And of course, this causes great difficulty for some of the animals which rely on the pack ice to hunt at some times of the year, such as polar bears. We're already seeing differences at 1 degree. The differences in weather patterns and intense weather patterns, extreme weather events that we will see at 5 degrees will be even higher. Of course, Christians are already concerned about this. This year, leading up to the UN meeting in Glasgow, the churches are encouraging, the churches together in Britain and Ireland are encouraging churches, local churches, to run climate Sundays, talking about the environment, talking about how it connects to our faith, encouraging churches to join in with the Roche's Eco Church project, where we can measure the carbon footprint of our churches and our lives and take steps to reduce that. And BUEN, this new environmental network of the Baptist Union, good in Spanish, connecting with the idea that creation is good. That's encouraging the churches of the Baptist stream of the church to engage more with this and recognize this as an important part of our ministry and mission with God, and also our discipleship. Perhaps we've been a little bit slow on that as Baptists. The Church of England have had care of creation as their 5th mark of mission for quite a while now. But I want to look at these two phrases, rewilding and ecology and ecosystem, and think about how they might help us to think about some of the shifts that we need to make in our thinking, in our acting, in our being, as we travel forward into this changing environment of the 21st century with man-made climate change, and what we need to do to mitigate it and stop it. So let's think about the word ecology first, or the word ecosystem, which describes this interconnection of life that we're beginning to understand more and more about, how life just is interconnected and interdependent on one another. I'm a little uncomfortable with the phrase ecosystem. It seems to be a very engineering word, the word system, a very mechanistic system. And maybe it's an example of what Pope Francis in Laudato Si, where he discusses the environmental crisis from a Christian viewpoint, calls the technocratic imagination, where we see nature to be manipulated and understood through our scientific way and rational way of thinking. Of course, ecology seems to be a much softer word. It's derived from two Greek words, oikos, which means household, and logos comes out of logos comes logy, which of course means word. So here we have household and word coming together. We're talking about the household of creation. And oikos has been a word which has been used by Christians through the centuries, right back into the Bible. The church has been described in the Bible as the household of God, the oikos of God. And this idea of church as household, as interconnected community, is very important from a Baptist point of view. It's the heart of what we understand as the church. We're not a very hierarchical organization. We're a network of independent local churches which are interdependent upon one another. We describe the local church as a covenant community, and the same will be true about our wider network of churches. This was at the heart of some of the earliest confessions of faith of the Baptist churches in this country. The London Baptist Confession from 1644 described the local church as a company of visible saints joined to the Lord and to one another. Often when we talk about the idea of covenant, we think about a relationship between God and an individual, and that's sometimes very central to the way we understand gospel and salvation. It's about God rescuing and giving life to individuals. But here's an idea, actually, that beyond that individual connection with God, actually we're connected into a wider community of believers, and that's at the heart of the idea of the church, that we are in a covenant with other Christians in which we gather together into an independent community. I think Paul Fiddis has described the idea of church as covenant community as one of the perhaps few theological innovations that Baptists have shared with the wider church over the last 400 years. So rather than thinking as a church or our faith is about God and me, Baptists would stress this the nature of the church as the body of Christ rather than the individuality of members within it. So the nature of our relationship with one another in covenant is God and me and actually others, and together we form this integrated, interdependent community. Together connecting with God. Of course, there are hints in the Bible that maybe we should see the idea of church as household, as oikos, as wider than this. If you go back to one of the early eco stories in the Bible, the story of the flood, and how it describes Noah's part in that. It says of him that by faith, he built an ark to save his household. Now, the household included his sons and his daughter-in-law and his wife. But remember, God's act of salvation with Noah wasn't just for his nuclear family. It actually was for the animals that joined him in the ark. And at the end of the story, you get God establishing a covenant, not just with Noah and his descendants, but actually Noah, his descendants, and every living creature that it says joined him in the ark. Maybe here's a hint here of a concept of oikos beyond humanity and the church as the household of God, towards an idea that the oikos of creation, the household of creation, is what God is concerned about. This is something that Richard Dawkins, in his book Bible and Ecology, draws out, that he stresses there and suggests that humanity belongs to this theocentric community of creation whose purpose is to give back to God in praise the being he has given them. It's not only humans that have a relationship with God, but the entire creation has a relationship with God, and we all play our part in raising praise up to God. The final couple of Psalms speak about the praise of creation being lifted up to God, as well as the praise of human beings. Wendell Berry, 25 years before Richard Dawkins wrote his book, actually, I think, expressed a similar idea. He was an American author and environmental activist. But he said humans as creatures of God are members of a holy community of creation, inextricably joined to each other, indebted to each other, and receiving significance and worth from each other. I think this is very covenantal language, this community of creation, joined to each other, indebted to one another, receiving significance and worth from one another. And perhaps in our encountering of one another, humans and the wider creation, we catch glimpses and encounter God, who is over it all. Perhaps this is more akin to what Pope Francis calls a sacramental imagination, where we encounter God within the world, that creation itself is a window through which we sometimes catch the glory of God and encounter God, and through which God speaks to us. So maybe we should think, as we move into this changing environment of the 21st century, about the wider oikos, the wider household of God, the wider ecosystem of God, of which we are a part and others are a part, but actually the whole of creation is a part. We are not separate from God's creation. We are part of it, integrated, independent upon it. Maybe we need to see this as the wider household, the wider community of creation that God has placed us in. Yes, we may have a distinct role within that and a distinct relationship with God. And yet we also are part of this wider community, which also has a relationship with God, and which God says is good and which God cares for. And maybe this idea of a wider oikos, this community of creation, will begin to shape the way we see joining in God's mission. If God is the one who creates and sustains creation, maybe our mission too has to be involved with joining with God's mission, and the Missio Dei, in sharing God's concern for creation and not only our neighbours as people, but our neighbours as the other creatures and in the ecosystem of the world, of the planet. What about rewilding? What might that say to us about journeying through this changing environment, changing world with climate change? Rewilding refers to creation unhindered by human influence, shaped by its natural interdependency. There's some tension there with the biblical vision of humanity's role within creation, for we are given authority to exercise control and influence on it. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living thing upon the face of the ground, God says at the end of Genesis chapter 1. In an essay in the late 1960s, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, Lynn White, who was a medieval historian, saw too strong a view of this subduing and dominion as control, as actually being at the root of the ecological crisis. I think this is an amazing visionary paper from so far ago, before we're even starting to think about climate change and had just started to think about the environmental impact of human activity. He said in this paper published in Science magazine, not a theological journal, we shall continue to have a worsening economical crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. Now, he wasn't critical of the whole of Christianity. He said Eastern Christianity had a softer view of man's relationship with creation. He was referring more to the development of theological thought in the Western church and Western Christianity, where it was assumed through much of church history that, at least for the last 1,000 years, that creation was there to serve humanity. We could shape it as we had need. That was a God-given mandate. He actually rooted this shift in thinking about creation to a shift in the 13th and 14th century from a previous way of thinking about the world, realism, which was based upon Plato's philosophy, and looked for signs and symbols of God within creation, a sacramental view of creation, towards a new emergent philosophical and theological system called nominalism, which Taylor actually sees as the roots of modern day science and the triumph of modern day science in its mechanization of the world. If you wanted to discover something about God, then look at creation itself. Focus on what the material things you could see. In Taylor's view, actually, modern science didn't arise with Darwin or the Enlightenment and its challenge to faith. None of those things was the source of the conflict of science and faith, but it rose in this shift between realism and nominalism in the 13th and 14th century, which Lynn White also refers to. Of course, contrary to this and parallel to this, there are signs of rewilding, perhaps in the Old Testament narrative. In the fall stories, we're told that cursed is the ground because of you, and thorns and thistles it shall bring forth. And then in a more positive way, in expressing our relationship with creation, humanity and the nation of Israel are told to leave the land fallow, to let the land have a Sabbath in the 7th year, to let it rewild itself, to emphasize our dependency upon the land. We're allowed to eat what is produced by the land, but also the land is there for the wild animals as food too. And Balkan also points out that in Bible and ecology that there are parts of creation which are not meant for humankind, but are meant for other creatures. So in Psalm 104, it talks about the cedars of Lebanon that God planted, and in them the birds build their nests, homes for the birds. And then the high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the coldness. The high mountains are for the wild goats. Seems to say that this is an environment not for human beings, but for other creatures. So it seems that we, as humanity, as a creature within creation, we live between these two two tensions of to influence and control the earth to some degree, but also to let it remain wild in other ways. And we live between the tension of those two things. And perhaps at the moment in our environmental crisis, we've got that tension badly wrong. We focus more upon control rather than letting the world have its own natural and wild life. In terms of how we therefore live with this idea of dominion over the earth, there's been a change in recent thinking between the idea of control, that we can shape creation, towards stewardship, which care for creation expresses as a phrase. But actually, perhaps stewardship also embraces something that Borkham again points out in the Torah, that our relationship with creation doesn't necessarily need to be intervention, but also in terms of restraint and letting be. But stewardship is a tricky word. What does it mean to steward the earth and creation? What's it mean to care for creation? That stewardship cannot be absolute even from a scientific point of view, because we don't fully understand the way that the world works. And if we don't understand the rules by which the world works, it's going to be very hard for us to steward it in a way that maintains it. Perhaps the present ecological and climate crisis is just an example of that we have an inability, in a sense, to understand the way the world works and understand the consequences for our actions. I think too much of a focus on stewardship as a human responsibility also doesn't leave space for God's stewardship of creation. He is the creator. He is the one who sustains the world. He is the over-steward. We are the co-stewards, perhaps, with him. And I think, again, too strong a stress on the humanity of stewards of creation kind of sets to one side nature's ability to steward itself. This is, I guess, at the heart of Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which is a very strong expression of this interconnectivity of nature sustaining itself. But there are examples through the Earth's history of the Earth, of the ecosystem being able to renew itself after the mass extinctions. There's been 5 of those through the last 500 million years, some of them removing 95% of marine life on the planet through volcanic eruptions or asteroidal impact. So nature does have this capacity to steward and renew itself as well. Maybe behind both this idea of ecology and rewilding and in helping us to think about how we live as Christians, how we think about the Christian message, maybe at the heart of both of them, we need to think about rewilding the gospel. I wonder if we need to kind of have an eco-alpha course, which includes in our exploration of the meaning of Jesus and the hope he brings and the life we're called to live as followers of Jesus. We need to embed a thread in that of what it means to live in relationship with the rest of creation. Actually, this logo is something I found on the internet, Eco-Alpha. It's not a Christian discipleship program. No, it's a logo of an environmental consultancy company in the US. There has been some attempts to rewild the gospel. The idea that what happens on the cross at Easter is not just about humanity, but it's about the whole of creation being drawn back to order. That through Jesus, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Perhaps we see something of that influence in these old Celtic stone crosses that we see, especially in the northern part of the United Kingdom in Scotland, with their carvings of nature and animals placed on the heart of the cross, that this is Jesus who comes not only to reconcile humanity to the earth, but to reconcile the whole of creation to God, a rewilding of the gospel. And I have to say, in both those books that we started taking the phrase rewilding and ecology and ecosystems from, which are talking about pioneering ministry, both have a connection to an understanding of the environment and creation. In Imagining Mission, there is even a chapter on care for creation. In Rewilding the Church, there are lots of amazing examples of how nature works and how nature has been rewilded by humans stepping out of the way. But in this chapter on caring for creation in Imagining Mission, in talking about the pioneering work of the church that we need in this century, it still has a hint of duality about it, that the gospel is not quite as wild as it might be. It says care for creation should be at the front and center of our mission, without losing the heart of the mission, which is Jesus Christ. But perhaps care for creation is the heart of mission, which is Jesus Christ. As we, in fact, our Celtic ancestors actually saw the tree as a symbol of the cross, connecting earth and heaven, a majestic sign, as Esther de Waal says, of the connectedness between the creator and the created, both human and non-human. So as we come to the end of our time together, this is a critical year for climate change. This is a critical decade. What we do in this decade will set the trajectory probably for the trajectory of our lives, the future generations of the ecosystem of the earth over the next 80 to 100 years. We know where we are now. We have an indication of how bad it could get. And we know what we need to do. We need to reduce our carbon emissions and mitigate the changes that are occurring. Perhaps we need, though, to think about something else. It strikes me in reading these two books about pioneering and fresh expressions of new forms of church, they're less about what we need to do, but they are more about what we need to be as disciples of Jesus Christ in these days. So what do we need to be as his people living in a changing environment? I want to just end with some more words of Lynn White, who saw this idea of dominion and control as at the root of the ecological crisis. He said that our science is so tinctured by orthodox Christian arrogance towards nature that no solution to our ecological crisis can come from it. Because the roots of this crisis, in his view, are religious, spiritual, then the remedy must be essentially religious. I was interested to hear as people reflected on the life and the work of the Duke of Edinburgh, who died a few weeks ago, and his work in conservation, how much he encouraged faith communities to get involved in this area, because he saw faith and spirituality in connection with God as a huge motivation to care for creation and all its creatures. And maybe just as we're looking to pioneering ministries to bring renewal to the church and to bring new life and energy to the kingdom of God, maybe we need to look to the fringe of our faith and our spirituality to draw on new resources to enable us to walk through this changing environment with God in his mission. Certainly Lynn White thought so. He ended his essay saying that St. Francis tried to substitute the idea of equality of all creatures, including man, for man's limitless rule. I propose St. Francis as the patron saint for ecologists. Maybe as we walk together with God in his mission, we too need to look to the fringes for us to discover how we should go ahead as his church into his future. Thanks for listening, and I hope that's been helpful today.